If you're familiar with Irish whiskey, you've heard of single pot still Irish whiskey. It's a style of whiskey that's unique to Ireland, but how different is it to single malt? Well, I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and today I've got two whiskies which should be very similar. This here is a single malt and this here is a single pot still Irish whiskey from the same distillery that went into the same casks for the same amount of time. So let me get into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about them. Now, first off, what is single pot still Irish whiskey and how is it different to single malt Irish whiskey? Well, single pot still is kind of similar on paper. It has malted barley as a core ingredient of the whiskey, but it's a bit different in that it allows a little bit of freedom in the mash bill. So single pot still whiskey has to be made with at least 30% malted barley, at least 30% unmalted barley, and at most 5% other grains, whereas single malt has to be made with 100% malted barley. This flexibility in the kind of pot still mash bill allows distilleries to be a little bit creative. Some will go down the middle, 50-50, malted, unmalted. Some will go 60-40, 70-30, 30-70. Some will add in those extra 5% of other grains and they'll play around with it to kind of create their own unique spin on a whiskey that'll go into casks and have different kind of flavor. So it does, on paper at least, have a little bit of a flavor difference, but today I'm going to see if it is basically just single malt with a little bit of an accent. So right here, what I've got in front of me are two whiskies from the Dingle distillery. Dingle is one of those old Irish whiskey distilleries. So it's kind of one of the first of the craft whiskey distilleries. It's been around producing whiskey for a little over 10 years now, and they're in the process of getting ready to launch some age statement whiskies, but they don't have enough kind of stock of those older whiskies to put out something like that. So they've done this series right here. These are 2 bottles from a 9 bottle series where they release a new whiskey every 3 months or so, commemorating a different Celtic holiday. It's called the Celtic Wheel of the Year, and these whiskies are kind of fun in that they take different whiskies, either single malt or single pot still, and they put them in different casks to kind of explore what the influence of those casks had on the whiskies, and also conduct a little bit of market research and see what whiskies people, that fans of whiskey, actually like, so then Dingle can make more of that whiskey. These here though went into the same casks. So this here is a single malt that spent about 5 years in bourbon casks before being finished or giving like a second maturation for 2.5 years in Sagamore rye casks from the Sagamore distillery in America. This here, single pot still whiskey that spent 5 years in those same bourbon casks before being finished for 2.5 years in those same kind of rye casks from the Sagamore distillery in America. So on paper, the cask influence of these is very, very similar, but it's not just the cask influence, because both of these are made entirely of barley. So what Dingle do for their mash bill, for their pot still, they go 60% malted barley and 40% unmalted barley. So 60% of this whiskey should be the exact same as this whiskey here, with that 40% of that unmalted barley. So if you're not familiar with the kind of difference between malted and unmalted barley, they're both kind of sweet, but whereas malted barley gives you kind of this earthy kind of almost kind of floral sweetness, the single pot still gives you that kind of a little bit of extra, the unmalted barley, gives you that almost oily, spicy kind of flavor to accent the sweetness. So it's both sweet, but just in a different kind of way. Aside from that, the only real difference between these two whiskies is the ABV, and that's not even a real difference. This one here comes in at 50.5% or 101 proof, so 50.5% alcohol. This one here, 52.5% or 105 proof. So very, very similar, at least on paper, between the two, but let's go into them and see very much how different are they. Starting off with that single malt, the classic. If you're a fan of Scotch whiskey, you're very going to be familiar with single malt whiskey, but also some American whiskey distilleries are putting out single malt, and of course a lot of Irish whiskey distilleries are making single malt. Let's go in just quick on the nose. And actually, while I've got the nose up, I'll compare it against the two of them. So right off the bat, so Dingle's single malt, Dingle's kind of malted barley, has this kind of almost floral herbal quality, and that is coming through here very much. You get that kind of almost minty herbal character, and it's still here on the single malt, but it's a lot spicier. So this one here, again, you're going to get that rye cask influence, you're going to get that kind of bourbon cask with the caramel, vanilla, butterscotch, those flavors coming through. But here it's a lot spicier. Like that unmalted barley, only 40% is in there, but it really does on the nose feel like a very different whiskey. So it seems very, very apparent on the nose that they're quite different whiskies. This here almost, now it is 2% lighter on the ABV, but it's almost more caramelly, more rounded. Like I said, that kind of softer, more earthy kind of sweetness, whereas here, a bit more peppery, a bit more punchy, a little bit more weight to it. And I personally, I find I prefer single pot still whiskies, especially when they're put into casks that maybe have a bit of wine influence to them, where there's a lot of fruitiness and you get that kind of peppery spice kind of punches through and works with the fruity flavors to give you a nice kind of extra balance, an extra bit of hit of flavor. I know I have poured these on camera in front of myself, so I know that they're very much different whiskies, but like, even though 60% of this whiskey is the same as with this whiskey, essentially, they're very, very different. You would not kind of think that these are similar. You would still kind of, if you're familiar with Dingle's kind of profile, you would still kind of maybe imagine this is from Dingle because it has that herbal quality to the maltiness in it. But yeah, it's just, this one's a little bit kind of lighter, brighter, sharper almost, like with that peppery spice coming through. So very much on the nose at least, very, very different whiskies. That kind of difference is even more obvious when a distillery has used those 5%, like I was saying, those 5% other grains. We add a bit of oats or rye or wheat into the mash bill, and you really get a bit of extra different flavor coming in. But here I thought it would be the best kind of experiment to demonstrate how different the two styles are, because we've got that single malt, the single pot still from the same distillery, using the same barley, went into the same cask. So I think very, very similar. But if you have kind of other ideas for ways we could compare the different styles of whiskey, let me know down in the comments below. But right now, I'm going to taste the single malt. It's floral, it's fragrant, it's kind of, it has a little bit of a spice to it from that kind of bourbon and rye cask, but it's more like oaky spice than peppery spice. You get that richness of the single malt, the kind of caramelly flavor. It's quite thick, and on the finish, as I'm talking now, it's still there. I'm still getting that kind of cask influence, a little bit of the oak spice, but it's not a super, super long finish. Like, it is nice, it's there, but it's kind of, it does kind of fade fairly quickly. It leaves me a nice little bit of sweetness and a little bit of a tingle there, but I expect to have a little bit more on the single pot still. So let's go in for that single pot still with that bit of extra spiciness, bit of extra oiliness. Cheers. Definitely worlds apart. Like this one here, it's much more spicy. It's much more kind of a punch. It hits your tongue, it spreads out, and you get that peppery spice. You get that almost like cloves, white pepper, black pepper, just tingling on my tongue. Very, very different. I will say the cask influence though has brought these maybe more into kind of alignment than it was on the nose. On the nose, kind of really, really different, almost worlds apart. On the palate, aside from that, like that hit of peppery spice, it's still got that kind of softer on the finish. It's still got a lot of that bourbon cask, that kind of caramel butterscotch, like I was saying. You still get that kind of rye, almost herbaceous note, where a little bit of like, almost like licorice or like black pepper or like black licorice or the like black tea, those kind of things coming in here with that peppery pot still spice. Yeah, very, very different up front, and then it kind of softens out and it does smooth out, because a lot of people will say that when you're making whiskey, like there's really three things at play in the kind of the flavor of the whiskey. It's what goes into the spirit, first off, what goes into the barrels, what barrels you use, and then how long it spends in those barrels. So you get the mash bill and you get those other two things. They kind of all combine together to make a different kind of whiskey. Here though, we've only got that one thing being the difference there, the actual mash bill, what went into the barrels. I think the barrels here have definitely brought them very closely into alignment. Yeah, like that first hit, here it's caramel, almost like honey, thick, rich. Here, it's a bit oily, but it gives you that punch of pepper, that hit of peppery spice. And then they both soften it. You both get that bourbon and rye cask. So for me, I think they're definitely different whiskeys. Like they're very, very clearly different whiskeys. Obviously, there's 40% unmalted barley in there. But for those people who kind of wonder, oh, is Irish single pot still whiskey, is it a special kind of whiskey? Should it be its own special category? I think Yes, it should. With that freedom the distilleries have to play around with the mash bill, to go 60-40 like here, or 70-30, or add those extra 5% of the grains, or even with the rules they might be changing slightly in future to go at least 30% malted, at least 30% unmalted, and at most 30% other grains. So you might see more oats, more rye, more wheat being brought into Irish whiskies, especially Irish pot still whiskies, which will completely change the dynamic of flavour. So yes, I think very, very different whiskies, not just kind of a single malt whiskey with a different bit of an accent. Like, I think at the core, at the fundamental level, the whiskey is very different. If you treat it like another whiskey, if you put it into the same casks for the same amount of time, yeah, you're going to get a similar product and that you're going to get some similar flavors, but still, they are kind of quite different. They're quite separate. They have a different character, a different feel to them. But what do you think? Have you tried these whiskies from Dingle, or have you tried other kind of single malts and single pot stills from the same distillery? And do you think that they are different? Do you think they are a completely separate category worthy of protection? Let me know down in the comments below. But me, I've got two very nice whiskies in front of them, so I'm going to keep on enjoying them, and I'll see you next time. Sláinte.